Samuel in this lesson right here. I guess before we get started, Kobe, can you lead us in a word of prayer? Daily Bible reader count? Let's get my notes straight. We'll begin the lesson by kind of summing up where we've been. As this is the final lesson, we've studied Samuel since his birth. Does anybody need a quarterly for the last week? I need a bigger podium. But we studied Samuel since his birth. And we studied the example of Hannah and how devoted she was and how she gave Samuel up to Eli and how he was raised in the tabernacle there and working with Eli. And then he soon replaced Eli and become the judge of the people. And he was the last judge of the Israelite people. And we talked about how the people really become, I guess, unsettled, and they wanted a king just like the other nations. They wanted to be just like those around them. They wanted a king to be able to protect them. They seemed to lose their faith in God, and they really wanted to put their faith and trust into a king who could protect them against all these nations in which they were surrounded by. So they asked for a king, and God agrees to give them a king, and he anoints Saul. Samuel anoints Saul as the new king. And we see Saul kind of get off to a pretty good start. He unites the people. He wins a great military battle. And you see Samuel step aside and kind of become more of God's prophet. But you quickly see Saul go down roads of disobedience and really do things he shouldn't do. And as we studied last week, Samuel anoints David then to take Saul's place. And from that point was in chapter 16. And go ahead and get your Bibles out. We're going to spend a lot of time in the Bible and not as much time in our quarterly. But from chapter 16 of 1 Samuel to where our lesson today takes place is mostly in chapter 28. So that's 12 chapters right there that we skip over. And the reason for that is we're studying about Samuel, and most of this period right here is about David and about Saul. And as I've been reading 1 Samuel, going through this, I found myself really engrossed into this story between David and Saul and their interaction. I've always been very fond of 1 Samuel. I always thought, as growing up as a little kid, David and Goliath was always my favorite Bible story. But looking back at this and really looking at Saul and David, there's so much material in these 12 chapters, and I really want to go through chapter by chapter and look at this. And as I read through this, I thought, this is just really the best story. It's got everything you could possibly want. It's got armies. It's got, political drama. It's got suspense, murder, and it's even got a giant. It has everything you could possibly want in a story. And as I thought about that, I thought, this would be just the most wonderful movie or TV show. And as a result, I just found out last week that there is a TV show that comes out, I think, maybe next week. It's going to be on, I think, ABC, called Of Prophets and Kings. Don't quote me on the name of that. But it seems like it's about Saul and David. So we'll see how accurate that is. But like I said, they really hit it because there's so much material in there, and it really is a good story. But let's look where we left off. David was anointed king, and that brings us to chapter 17. where we see, basically, we're all familiar with this, David and Goliath. You see David, he kills Goliath, and then things really start to change for Saul's kingdom at that point. If you'll turn over in chapter 18, we see as David, after he kills Goliath, he kind of becomes an instant celebrity of the people. You see in verse 7 right here, you see David has killed Goliath. Saul puts David over his armies. He's a great military leader. Things are going pretty good, but then Saul overhears some of the people saying in verse 7, and the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And it seems like this really, Saul could never overcome this. He become so jealous and almost so paranoid that it drives the next several chapters, and just based on this simple saying. And but you see in next in verse 20, Saul comes up with a plan. Well, actually, back up to verse 11. It doesn't take Saul long before he tries to kill David. And Saul cast a javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of the presence twice. So immediately Saul becomes so enraged that he tries to kill David. David is able to avoid it in that instant. And Saul comes up with the next big plan where he's going to give off one of his daughters to marry David. And you see that he does that. He tries one daughter, but he ends up and he has her promised to someone else in verse 17. Verse 20, one of his daughters is really infatuated with David, so it works out well. He's got a daughter who loves David. So Saul gives his daughter Michal to David to marry. And David is, he's grown to instant fame here, so he's a little taken back by the king would offer his daughter to him. He's always a very humble guy, as we find through the scriptures. But Saul works out a plan with some of his advisors to go tell David, if you really want to marry the king's daughter, you need to go out and kill, I think in the verse 25, I think. And Saul said, thou shalt ye say to David, he's telling his advisors to say this to David, the king desireth not a dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged on the king's enemies. So his advisors tell David, if you really want to impress the king, that's what you need to do. And hoping the Philistines would kill David in this process, but we find that doesn't happen. David he overtakes the Philistines, gives Saul what he thinks he wants. So everything moves on from there. So that brings us to chapter 19. And this is where we're introduced to Jonathan again with David. And they quickly become really, really close friends. There's a great relationship between them. And Jonathan is almost going to be a spy for David. And he's going to help him out and look after him in Saul's presence. In verse 10, we see that Saul sought to smite David again, even to the wall with a javelin. But he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Saul's daughter, Michal, helped David escape. You see that. David goes to see Samuel, and he tells Samuel all about what's happened. Saul has turned against me. He's trying to kill me. You see later on in the few verses there that Saul goes down, and he goes to seek David, and he seeks him with Samuel. And we see that Saul, kind of something overtakes him, and he starts prophesying, and this gives David time to escape again from Saul's presence. So that brings us to chapter 20. David has escaped Saul. This is where you see David and Jonathan working together. Jonathan's going to ask Saul, basically, if he's still trying to kill David. This is where they have a plan to shoot arrows. Jonathan's going to shoot arrows. David's out hiding in the wilderness. And he's going to tell his messenger if Saul is still trying to kill him or not. And David's going to overhear that, and that's when he's going to know if he can come back or he cannot. And Saul is still trying to kill David at that point. He even attempts to kill Jonathan, his son, in verse 33. And Saul cast a javelin at him to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David. So Saul still, and at this point, has David ever done anything to Saul? He's not. He's been the best he could possibly be. He's never wronged Saul in any way. All David did was he killed Goliath, and he did what Saul asked him to do. But Saul is still overrun with jealousy and paranoia that you can just see it drives him mad. That brings us to chapter 21. David, as he flees, once Jonathan has told him it's not safe for him anymore, he goes to see a priest, Ahimelech. And this is where David eats the showbread. And Jesus references this in Mark chapter 2. But while he's there, he runs across a guy named Doeg. And Doeg's an Edomite. And we know the Edomites, they're the sons of Esau. But you see Doeg, and he is a member. He's with Saul, so he reports back to Saul that David is with this priest. And this is where things really get bad for Ahimelech. It gets bad for his family and all the priests there because he has assisted David. Before David leaves the priest, he takes Goliath's sword with him, and he heads to Gath. And Gath is one of the nations of the Philistines, and that's where David goes. Now, in chapter 22, we see that Saul is notified by Doeg that Ahimelech had assisted David. So Saul basically summons Ahimelech and all the priests there. They bring him to him. And in verse 14, Ahimelech tries to reason with Saul, saying, I helped David. And he starts to speak about David. He says, Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, And who is so faithful among all the servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to any of the house of my father, for thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. So he didn't have any clue that Saul was trying to kill David, and Saul was angry with David. He just knew that Saul was this great son-in-law of David and was a great man. David had not done anything wrong, so why would he have anything to say? But Saul becomes very enraged, and he orders his men to kill Ahimelech and all the priests there. His men refuse because they don't want to harm God's priest. But then Saul turns to Doeg in verse 18, the Edomite, and he seems to comply to kill all the priests, and he kills 85 priests right then and there. And then in verse 19, and they went back to Nob, which is the city of the priest, and he smote with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and sucklings, and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. And I read that, and I found what the irony in that statement, that Saul, when God commanded Saul to go out and strike and kill the Amalekites, he didn't want to harm any of that. He wanted to bring a lot of stuff back. He failed at doing that. But he was so enraged at this man for just helping David that he was willing to go and wipe this whole group of people out from the city of Nob. So you can see where sometimes it was hard for me to understand sometimes early on in Saul's life. It seemed like he always had good intentions on some of the things he did, but he was always just off. At this point in Saul's life, his intentions are bad, and everything he does is evil, and you can see the transition. But you see, I thought quite ironic that he was so willing to do this for someone who's helped David. Feel free to speak up. Like I said, we got a lot of verses and chapters to cover, but I don't want to sit here and talk the whole time either. All right, that brings us to chapter 23. David has an army at this point. He's fled around. He's got followers. We can see the nation of Israel is almost in a full civil war period, with David having several followers. You see that in verse 1. And he's not just hiding. he's doing what God wants him to do. So he goes and battles the Philistines. He's still fighting battles. So he's still doing what God wants him to do. He always asks God anytime he does something, should I go do this? And God said, yes, go battle. And at the end of the chapter 23, Saul actually corners David, and he's got him cornered in a mountain, and it seemingly is the end of David and his group of rebels. But the Philistines at the same time were attacking Israel. They were taking advantage of this split nation, and they were trying to edge in and gain as much ground as they could. So Saul had to leave David on that mountain stranded, and he had to go fight the Philistines. So God intervened in that situation and saved David. It brings us to chapter 24. This is where Saul returns back to David. He quickly battles off the Philistines, and he goes back to his main purpose in life at this point, to hunt down and kill David because of his jealousy. And he gets David, and then he goes and he doesn't know he finds him, but he goes into a cave to rest, and just lo and behold, David and his army are resting deeper into that cave. So David, it's a great opportunity for him to actually end this strife and kill Saul, but David refuses to do that because he is always an honorable man, and he does not want to strike God's anointed and kill him. So what he does, he goes up to Saul, cuts a little part of his robe out, and what we see as he leaves the cave, he tells Saul, if I wanted to kill you, this is my chance. I could have done it. Trying to reason with Saul, which it's hard to reason with Saul at this point in his life, but just saying, I don't know why you're attacking me. I've not done anything wrong to you, and if I wanted to hurt you, I had the opportunity to do that. And we see Saul's reaction to this like we saw sometimes in the early parts of his life. He repented. He really did seem like he felt upset about it. And let's look at verse 16 of chapter 24. And it came to pass when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, Is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, Thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil. And thou hast showed this day how that thou hast dealt well with me, forasmuch as when the Lord had delivered me into thy hand, thou killest me not. So we see later on that Saul even asked David, I know this kingdom is going to be yours. In verse 21, Swear now therefore unto me, by the Lord, that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And we know that David obeyed that commandment later on. Once he had the opportunity, he really did want to take care of Saul's seed. Okay. Chapter 25 is first verse right there of chapter 25 is part of our quarterly lesson. And Samuel died. It's after this time that Samuel dies, and all the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him and buried him in the house of Ramah. That's where Samuel was from. That's where he liked to live. Where he lived. But we do see that Samuel dies at this point. Now, the majority of our quarterly is going to pick up a period of time later. But we see Samuel has died at that point. Chapter 25, David meets, it's soon to be his second wife, but he's got his army in the wilderness. He sends them out to a rich man, seemingly a Nabal, to see if he could maybe offer them any kind of assistance at all. Nabal is not a good person, and he rejects David's servants. This angers David, and David is going to strike him down. But Nabal's wife intervenes, Abigail, because she's seemingly smarter. She understands the situation better, and she intervenes throughout the night and takes David's men a whole bunch of supplies. And as she returns back home, in verse 38, she doesn't spend very much time at home. And it came to pass that after about 10 days after that she had returned, that the Lord smote Nabal, and he died. So Nabal dies right then. Shortly after Abigail, his wife, returns, David marries Abigail in verse 39. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he married Abigail then. And then in verse 42, you see, and Abigail hasted and arose, and in the end right here, he takes her as wife. And then in verse 43, David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they were both his wives. So during this chapter right here, you see David, he takes two wives, and he loses one. because Saul gives his first wife to someone else. So much stuff going on in these chapters right here. So much in the life of David and Saul. Questions, comments? All right, we're almost to our lesson quarterly. We got a couple chapters to go. Chapter 26 finds David that he does run across Saul again. Saul's army still on the hunt for David. Is camped out under David. David has the opportunity to go over there. He takes his spear, takes his water, and then they go through kind of a similar exchange from the cave period where David hollers off from afar off, "Hey, I could have killed you again." Saul seemingly repents again in verse 25. But at this point, most of us would have given up on Saul a long time ago. David seemed to have a lot of patience with Saul, more so than anyone can possibly imagine. But at this point, I think after this, Saul trying to repent at this point, you see in chapter 27, verse 1, I think David understands at this point, he's going to die, Saul's going to kill him, and Saul's never going to give up on killing him. So David flees to the Philistines. He goes to the king of Gath, Achish, and he basically becomes his, I guess, not his servant, but King Achish agrees to give David some land in Ziklag, which is an area in between Philistine and Israel, just kind of right there on the border. And so David takes him and all his rebels and all his people, and they go and they stay there for over a year. But at this time, the major enemy of Israel had been the Philistines, and now they've got Israel's greatest warrior has come to live with them. So you can see the wheels turning in their heads in that we're about to run through Israel. We need to unite as a people. And the Philistines, they were a group of people. It wasn't just one nation. They were a nation of about 5 different types of people. If you're familiar with the Gaza Strip, currently, it's kind of in that area close to the coast. But you can see the wheels are turning in their head, and you see the foreshadowing that it's about to get bad for Israel because they've got David basically under control. Now is the time to unite and attack. And that brings us to where we are in our lesson in chapter 28. All right. Comments, questions? That was a quick recap. I hope that made sense to y'all as we went through that. And as I thought back to, I don't know who did the lesson over Saul not waiting for the sacrifice, waiting on Samuel for the sacrifice. But he had the Philistine army was right there against him at that point, and you could see he was scared. And anytime Saul is scared and fearful, he does the wrong thing. And in that point, he just couldn't wait. He needed to offer the sacrifice, couldn't wait on Samuel out of fear. Well, he's going to have the Philistine army united against him in chapter 28, and they're coming to him. And let's just pick up in our quarterly, if you care, and we're going to read from verse 3 right here, chapter 28. Now Samuel had died, and all of Israel had lamented for him and buried him in Ramah, in his own city, and Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. So you see at this point, it was against the law of Moses in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 31. It banned all mediums, witches, wizards, things of that nature. And Saul had done a good job. He had kicked them all out of Israel. Then the Philistines gathered together and came and encamped on Shanuim. So Saul gathered all Israel together, and they encamped on Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. You see this army encamped against him, it's massive. So he's scared. And what did Saul do? And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. So the Lord had abandoned Saul at this point, where Saul had long abandoned the Lord. Then Saul said to his servants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servants said to him, "In fact, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor." So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes, and he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night, and he said, "Please conduct a seance for me, and bring up from me the one I shall name to you." Then the woman said to him, Look, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Why then do you lay a snare of my life to cause me to die? And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Well, then the woman said, whom shall I bring for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. And I'll pause here for just a second, and because there's a lot of questions. Honestly, I was not familiar with this story. I thought Samuel died. I was not as familiar that Samuel was actually raised from the dead in a sense. And so this raises a lot of questions. For me, first off, when you're thinking about witches, you're thinking about wizards, you're thinking about these mediums, you're thinking about all these powers that maybe these people had. And we've read in the Old Testament about some magicians in Moses' time when he was battling with Pharaoh. So we see that there were people with some special powers back then. But as we look at this particular one, was that a common power that Saul obviously thought that the mediums could, bring spirits back to the commune with each other? Was that something that was commonly done back then? Not really sure. And those are some of these things that maybe we'll just have to wait to get answers later on. But it seems that this woman is quite surprised that her seance actually worked. And if we see this in the next verse, as Saul has requested that you bring up Samuel, in verse 12, it says, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. So you see that this woman is quite surprised that it actually worked. So like I said, I don't know if this was a common practice, something that these people could do, or maybe it's more like today when we think about them putting on their show. Maybe that's what they were used to doing back then.
It seems to me that God used people at certain times to certain things, and this will prove all his end result. I would think that God would probably allow that lady to bring Samuel back so he could give him what he wanted him to hear.
Yeah. And I
think that's why she was surprised. She evidently was what you call a charlatan, putting on a show. And when she really brought Samuel back, she was shocked.
Yeah, it was quite the surprise.
She was also afraid.
Yeah, she was immediately afraid that it worked. And I think you're right on, Don. With the message, it's important that Saul heard this next message because it was going to be very important to him. In verse 14, so he said to her, what is his form? And she said, it's an old man is coming up, and he's covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel. And he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. Now Samuel said to Saul, and this is an important message, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I am deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me, and does not answer me any more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I've called you, that you may reveal to me what I should do. Then Samuel said, so why do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? So why, Samuel's basically saying, why? What could I tell you that the Lord has not already told you? And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me. I've already told you this, Saul. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. So we see right here that basically Samuel's role here, he is give a judgment on Saul. And it's not going to be too much longer in Saul's life, very short life, that his judgment is going to be passed. Yes, W.A.? That's exactly how we're going to close it. You're right. it's not a new message. So Saul, I guess, was hoping. He's so desperate. He's so fearful. He was hoping that God would save him and bail him out of this one. But God had spoke his truth to him long ago through Samuel, and the message did not change. So that brings us to chapter 29. At this time, David is with the Philistine army. They're together, and Israel's over here. The Philistines, they become quite jealous, and they become worried. Not jealous, but they become worrisome that David is going to maybe jump sides in the middle of the battle. So they ask David to leave. David agrees, and he does leave. And as he goes back in chapter 30, lo and behold, we see a return of someone who's long been gone. David goes back to Ziklag at his home, and he finds that all the people there, his wives, all the people's wives, all their stuff had been taken by the Amalekites, who were supposed to have been destroyed, and we find that they're not. So that they're all taken. So people they consider killing David at that point. But God speaks to David. David asks God what to do. They go take their people back. They get great spoils and riches from the Amalekites. And David, being a smart political man, he gives those spoils back to his people, and then he gives a part of those spoils back to Judah. So it's kind of like a truce offering right there. And then in the next chapter, chapter 31, that's the final chapter, the battle begins between the Philistines and the Israelites. And you see that very quickly Jonathan and his son and his brothers are killed almost quickly into it. And Saul is wounded. Saul asks his servant to kill him. His servant will not kill the anointed one. Saul falls on his sword because he's afraid of the torture that's about to come upon him. And he is right, because the Philistines, they cut off Saul's head, and then they put his body on parade, basically, for the whole country to see. So we see that Samuel issued that judgment on Saul, and it wasn't just shortly after that Saul was defeated. And that closes kind of the story of Samuel. It closes the story of Saul, and that brings us to 2 Samuel, where you see David transition to the kingdom. All right. Thank y'all very much.